Welcome to Sketchbook Legends. I'm your artist, Paul Hostetler. Today we're drawing the iconic Batman villainess, Catwoman. Now Catwoman's been a character who's been around for like over 80 years at this point, so there's a lot of story and lore behind her. She's been rebooted a couple of times. And like most comic book characters, if you take it all in at once, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But let's start at the beginning and see what we can get through. Catwoman's first appearance was in the comic book Batman #1 in the spring of 1940. For the non-comic book people out there, just because the comic was called Batman #1 does not mean it was also the first appearance of Batman. Batman originally showed up in the pages of a comic book called Detective Comics, and once he had proved that he was a popular character, they gave him his own title. But in Batman #1, the character who would eventually become known as Catwoman is just known as the Cat. She's a cat burglar, which makes sense, and she wears a green dress and normal sort of Mission Impossible style masks and disguises. Batman captures her in her first story, reveals her identity, also threatens to spank her because this was the year 1940 and the story was written by a man whose best prospects were in comic books. The writer-artist team for this issue was Bill Finger and Bob Kane. So it would be the non-controversial thing to say that Bill Finger and Bob Kane were the co-creators of the Cat and therefore Catwoman. But actual history is a little bit more complicated than that. You get Jerry Robinson in the mix, because Bob Kane, even at the beginning of his career, Bob Kane was notorious for being kind of a slippery little hack. If you watch most of the Batman movies, they'll have a credit that says Batman was created by Bob Kane. This is patently not true. Like most comic book creators in the 30s and 40s, he had to sign a contract with DC Comics, handing over all rights to Batman over to the company. But after Batman got popular, he claimed that he was underage while signing that contract, and therefore he was able to negotiate a better deal for himself, but not for any of his collaborators. Bill Finger, especially, was the one who came up with a lot of the different ideas about Batman that made the character popular. Jerry Robinson did most of the design work on Catwoman, even though Bob Kane was listed as the artist. Jerry Robinson was the ghost artist on this issue, while Bob Kane signed his signature to the artwork and sent it in to get the fame and fortune, and Jerry Robinson didn't get much beyond a paycheck for the one issue. So I'll go out on a limb and say that Catwoman was created by Bill Finger and Jerry Robinson, and I'll repeat myself that Bob Kane is a slippery little hack. Artists decided that if Catwoman is an enemy of Batman, who wears a bat-shaped cape and has bat ears on his mask, that Catwoman would do well to also wear a mask that had cat ears. It just makes an incredible amount of sense. Catwoman was a very popular character. Over and over for the next 15 years, she showed up in the comic books. At one point, her mask was like an anatomical cat head. She just looked like a woman with a cat's head. It was very bizarre. That didn't last too long. But in the early days of comic books, artists were encouraged to throw whatever ideas they had at the wall to see what sticks. In 1947, artists gave her a purple dress and a green cape to go along with it. Again, sort of mirroring Batman's look. And the mask that they gave her, the purple mask with the cat ears, has been the template for most of the drawn versions of the character since then. A few years later, they decided to take her out of the dress and give her pants, which again makes a lot more sense in context of Catwoman being a cat burglar. Climbing a wall and sneaking into windows in a long evening gown isn't the most practical get-up. Me, I'm drawing here Catwoman in a more modern costume. More skin tight, sort of a leotard style. I've got her with a big old pearl and jewel necklace in her mouth. I thought that would be kind of a nice touch, as if her hands were too busy with climbing around buildings and picking locks for her to hold on to a necklace at the same time. Although now that I think about it, she could just have put it around her neck. But I like the idea of the sort of cat-like theft where an animal who wants to pick up something and take it away will, pick it up with their mouths. That just adds a little bit of character to the illustration. In 1955, Catwoman sort of disappeared from the comic books for a good decade. 1955, if you know comic book history, that's the year that there were congressional hearings on the effect of comic books on America's youth. The consensus was among paranoid children, paranoid adults, that comic books were a lesser form of art that encouraged juvenile delinquency in kids. The biggest proponent of this theory was a psychiatrist named Frederick Wortham. He wrote a whole book about it called Seduction of the Innocent. And one of the things was that Catwoman, being both a woman and a villainess, was a a bad model of femininity for growing young girls, and also, I suppose, young boys who would, according to his theory, grow up to believe that all women were devious tricksters who climbed in and out of windows at night to steal things. In response to Congress and Frederick Wortham, the comic book industry decided to censor itself, and created the Comic Code Authority, which went through comics one by one and took out anything that could be seen as possibly contributing to juvenile delinquency. There were some really ridiculous rules about how police and politicians could be portrayed. Namely, they could only be portrayed in a good light as heroes. There were certain rules about the roles women could play. It was an extremely regressive set of rules that the Comic Code laid down for comics. It took a couple of companies straight into bankruptcy. And Catwoman was a casualty of that time. Artists and writers could not figure out how to get Catwoman in a story and make her interesting without violating the comic code. And if you violated the comic code, you weren't allowed to be sold at newsstands, which were the primary place people got their comic books back in the day. So they just disappeared her. So Batman didn't have any prominent female villains for 10 years up until 1965. What happened in 1965? That's when the Batman TV show with Adam West and Burt Ward went into development. TV executives are, I guess, a little bit smarter than comic book executives, and they realized that they needed some women on the show. So they brought back Catwoman, played by Julie Newmar in seasons 1 and 2, wearing a glittery sort of bodysuit. Eartha Kitt played Catwoman in season 3. And in the 1966 Batman movie, with the same cast, Lee Merriweather played Catwoman due to scheduling issues with Julie Newmar. The 1966 show and movie is also probably where Catwoman's status as a sex symbol was cemented. All the actresses were incredibly attractive. They all wore tight bodysuits and probably stirred the feelings of not a few young viewers. And that also sort of shaped how the character evolved from the 1960s on. There were a few artistic developments in regard to Catwoman in the 1990s. The first was Batman Returns, the Tim Burton movie in which Michelle Pfeiffer played Catwoman. They put her in a skin-tight black latex bodysuit with matching corset and a goth's paycheck worth of eyeshadow. She engages in a playful back and forth with Michael Keaton's Batman and exudes sort of a dominatrix vibe. At one point, she puts an entire bird in her mouth and spits it back out again. Quite shocking for audiences in 1990. 1992. 1993. But you could also say that Catwoman is the only character in that movie who gets a proper arc, shifting from a shy secretary to a confident career woman and a vigilante. She's the only character with a clear, emotionally driven goal to seek revenge on her employer, Max Schreck, who's a sort of Donald Trump stand-in played by Christopher Walken. Her origin story involves Christopher Walken's character throwing her out of a window. She's revived due to the pawing of street cats and spends the rest of the movie trying to kill him. Batman, of course, attempts to stop her, and Batman is kind of the reactive force throughout the entire movie. Danny DeVito also stars. I've given Catwoman, you can see a lot of leather in her costume. Leather boots, leather gloves. This is a holdover from the 90s movie. A lot of artists in the comic books took those cues and ran with them. I've also given Catwoman a tail. That is a remnant from the comic books, just to make her even more cat-like. Often artists and even Tim Burton will play around with the idea that Catwoman's silhouette looks a lot like a cat, like an actual cat, and people in the story will be unsure whether it's Catwoman or just a stray cat that's wandering around in the shadows. The other big development in Catwoman in the 90s was the Batman animated series, cartoon show for Fox Kids. Series co-creator Bruce Timm originally wanted Catwoman in an all-black outfit. He designed it as almost a silhouette, but that was seen as being too close to the Batman Returns version. So instead he drew a version that more resembled the 1966 show. It was a gray costume that had a little belt of bangles slung over the hips. You can see that I've added that to Catwoman's costume too. I thought it was a neat little accessory that helped break up the rest of the costume without adding a lot of seams or zippers or anything. In the comics, when the series was rebooted for Kids WB in 1977, Bruce Timm got to use his original design for Catwoman. Unfortunately, by that time, his artwork had kind of become so streamlined that every single female on the show had the exact same body type, skin tone, and color costume. If it weren't for the hair choices, you wouldn't have been able to tell any of the women apart. That sometimes happens to artists. Their styles just get more and more refined. In the comic books, it's become a thing where every 5 years or so, a new creative team gets to redesign the costumes for all the characters. Batman gets a new suit, Robin will get a new suit, and Catwoman usually gets a new suit. Prominent modern artists include Jim Balent, David Mazzucchelli, Darwin Cook, and currently Joelle Jones. my costume, I've pulled a little from the Mazzucchelli and the animated versions, as well as the Lee Merriweather version. While I do remember watching Batman 1966 reruns religiously as a kid, I don't remember the details of any of them at all. And I only watched the movie later in college. One detail I was sure to add was the very impractical high heels, just to add a little bit of unreality to the character. Not that Catwoman needs any more, given that she's wearing cat ears and a bodysuit that includes a big curly tail. But for some reason, directors and artists just can't help giving Catwoman heels. So, for the sake of fantasy and artistic license, I've done the same. I think we've entered a period currently where the real-life implications and the practicality of costumes is no longer such a concern for artists, for which I'm glad. I'm glad that we're able to just state outright that these characters aren't realistic. Even though it took me a lot longer than I expected, I wanted to add some background to this. I've put Catwoman on a bit of a ledge and had her kind of in a spotlight there, acting as if she's been caught in the act of a jewel heist. And that's Catwoman. Please click the like and subscribe buttons, or the like or subscribe buttons. They're intended to help you see more of this sort of thing, but they also help the channel and therefore vicariously me. You can also find me on Blue Sky at phostetlerart, all one word, and on Patreon at the same links below. Patreon helps me even more directly. I will need like 10,000 times more subscribers than I currently have to actually make this channel worth the time investment. But that's neither here nor there. Thanks for watching. Stay sketching. Stay legendary. See you next time.